He'd built an empire on the belief that money could fix anything it touched, and for 8 years that belief had never once failed him until the night it shattered on a frozen Chicago sidewalk. Knox Hartley was 35, a man whose name was spoken in whispers across the city's underworld, and everything about him was carved from cold control. The tailored black coat that fit like armor, the gray steel of his eyes that never flinched, the silence he wore heavier than any weapon. He owned casinos that printed money, restaurants that laundered it, and men who'd kill on a single nod from him. He hadn't set foot in his old neighborhood since he was 27. Since the night he'd walked out on his mother after a fight he'd never let himself remember. But he'd sent money home every single month without fail, wiring more than enough, trusting a man he'd paid handsomely to keep his mother comfortable, telling himself that providing from a distance was the same as caring. The only thing that had ever followed him out of that house was Bear, a massive black Neapolitan Mastiff, nearly 130 pounds of muscle and scar. A dog his mother had once rescued, half frozen as a pup, a dog who'd slipped out the door behind him 8 years ago, and never looked back. Now, all this time later, Knox had finally decided to come home not to apologize, he told himself, just to make peace, to look his mother in the eye one last time, and be done with the past. But before the Bentley even reached the house, before he could rehearse a single word, Bear went rigid on the leather seat, a low growl rolling up from somewhere ancient in his chest. Knox murmured for him to settle, but the dog wouldn't. Bear was already pawing at the door, straining toward something under a flickering streetlight up ahead, something Knox couldn't yet see. And when he finally stepped out into the biting cold and followed that old dog's pull, what he found waiting on the curb would rip the ground out from under a man who thought he'd long ago stopped feeling anything at all. A young woman, no older than 28, hollow-cheeked and shaking, cradling a frail figure wrapped in a thin coat, as though her own warmth was the only thing keeping that body alive. The woman lifted her face, terror and exhaustion warring in her tired brown eyes, and threw her arm out to shield the person behind her. "Please," she begged a stranger she had every reason to fear, "don't hurt her." And Knox Hartley, a man feared by half a city, went absolutely still because the fragile, forgotten figure she was protecting with the last of her strength was his own mother. If your heart's already aching for this woman and the secret she's carrying, take a second to hit that like button. Share this story with someone who believes no mother should ever be forgotten, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss a single moment of what happens next. Now, let's go back to that frozen sidewalk, where the most feared man in the city is about to kneel before the truth he's spent 8 years running from. Knox's knees touched the thin sheet of ice covering the sidewalk, and for the first time in many years, he forgot that he was cold. He no longer heard the young woman pleading. He no longer heard the Bentley's engine still running behind him. He heard nothing except the frantic pounding of his own heart as his gaze traced every line of the gaunt woman's face while she huddled in the arms of the strange girl. Her cheekbones were sunken deep, her skin stretched over bone as thin as paper. Her tangled gray hair was matted to her forehead, and her cracked lips trembled as she murmured broken words that couldn't form a sentence. He had looked at hundreds of faces in his lifetime. He had learned how to read fear, lies, and death in another person's eyes in the space of a heartbeat, and yet now his mind resisted, refusing to fit together the pieces slowly taking shape before him, the small hollow at the corner of her mouth when she moved her lips, the faint mole beneath her left ear, the curve of the chin he had last seen lifted with proud defiance in an old kitchen 8 years ago. Layer after layer of recognition crashed into him like waves striking stone, slowly, mercilessly, impossible to hold back. Ruth, his mother, the woman who had stood straight, backed through the harshest winters, who had carried the weight of raising him alone on a teacher's meager salary, was now nothing more than a ruined shadow trembling from the cold on the freezing concrete. Knox heard his own voice break out of him, hoarse and strange even to himself, softly calling one word, "Mother." She stopped murmuring. Her clouded eyes lifted slowly, passed over his face, and for one brief, breath-stealing moment, he thought she was about to recognize him. But then that gaze slipped away, empty, holding not even a trace of memory, as though she were looking through him in search of someone else who had vanished a very long time ago. She drew her shoulders in, shrinking deeper into the young girl's embrace, and in a tiny, shattered voice, she whispered that she was sorry. Please don't make her leave. She wouldn't bother anyone anymore. Every word she spoke drove into Knox's chest, like a blade dipped in ice. She wasn't afraid of him because he was some dangerous stranger. She feared him in the way of someone who had grown too used to being driven away. Someone who had learned that kindness was never meant for her. And what sent the deepest chill down his spine wasn't her wasted, pitiful appearance, but the fact that she didn't know who he was at all. The woman who had given birth to him, who had held him through childhood fevers, who had stayed up through the night mending the only coat he owned, now looked at him as though he were a stranger in the dark. Bear was no longer growling. The enormous dog moved forward quietly, his massive head lowered, and instead of the fierce suspicion from moments earlier, he pressed his muzzle against the woman's wrinkled, trembling hand, nudging her palm with a gentleness so strange it almost seemed unreal. Ruth flinched, but not because it hurt. Her bony fingers hesitated, then touched the dark fur, feeling their way over it as though trying to remember something at once familiar and impossibly distant. And a choked sound escaped her throat, half sob, half laugh. The dog dropped heavily to the ground beside her, his huge body blocking the bitter wind that swept along the street, as though he had been waiting for this moment through all 8 years of separation. Knox watched the scene, his throat tightening until it hurt. He had ordered powerful men to their knees. He had made an entire underworld city hold its breath at the sound of his name, but now he couldn't force one complete sentence from himself before this small, fragile woman. He slowly reached out, moving carefully, as if afraid he might shatter something impossibly delicate, and placed his hand over his mother's freezing hand. Her skin was colder than the ice beneath his feet, weightless, as though only a shell remained. She didn't pull away, not because she trusted him, but because she no longer had the strength to resist. And in that thick, suffocating silence, one single question began to burn low in Knox's mind, colder and sharper than any rage he had ever known. What had happened here? And who had allowed his mother to fall this far? The young woman didn't take her eyes off Knox for even 1 second, and when he moved a little closer to hold his mother's hand, she immediately leaned forward, using her own thin body to shield Ruth, her shoulders trembling from the cold, while her eyes burned with a toughness that was startling. She thought he was one of those men who still lingered on the streets at night, men who saw a frail old woman alone and waited only for the chance to take advantage of her, and her voice broke out hoarse but firm, telling him to step back, telling him that if he meant to do anything to the old woman, he would have to go through her first. Knox froze. In the world he had lived in for so many years, no one dared speak to him in that tone, and yet this exhausted girl, who clearly had nothing in her hands except courage, was ready to face a stranger twice her size in the middle of the night, just to protect an old woman who wasn't even her blood. He slowly raised both hands, lowering his voice as much as he could, and said he didn't mean to hurt anyone, that this woman was his mother. The girl went still, confusion flickering through her eyes. Then she shook her head as though she had just heard a blatant lie. She said the old woman had once been abandoned on the streets by a heartless facility, and since the day Della found her wandering in the cold and brought her back to that miserable rented room, she had been the only one who cared for her. She was the one who cooked her a bowl of hot soup on the nights when her cough came back, who took her to the doctor when she forgot even her own name, and not once, not a single time, had Ruth ever mentioned having a son. Her words cut into Knox more painfully than the cold seeping into his bones. He looked at the woman before him, at the brown hair matted by the night mist, the heavy shadows beneath her eyes, the thin coat worn and torn at the elbows, and he understood that she truly didn't know who he was, didn't know what weight the name Knox Hartley carried in the darkness of this city, and it was precisely that ignorance that made her all the more worthy of respect. "What is your name?" he asked, and after a moment of hesitation, she answered, "Della. Just one name, no surname," as though she had grown used to people not bothering to remember her. Just then, from the darkness near the brick wall, a faint sound rose, the soft stirring of a child, and Knox only then noticed that a few steps away there was an old stroller with rusted wheels, and inside it a little girl was waking up in fear from Bear's low growls, whimpering softly with her cheeks flushed pink from the cold, shivering despite being wrapped in layers of blankets. Della immediately turned back toward the stroller, her mother's instinct making her forget for a moment even the danger in front of her, and she gently pulled the blanket higher over her child. Knox stood up, and this time his voice had changed. It was no longer searching or wary, but a low command that allowed no refusal. He said they all had to get into the car right away, that his mother needed to reach a hospital before it was too late. Della hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the glossy black Bentley parked by the curb, a vehicle that belonged to a world completely different from this broken street, and suspicion rose in her again. But then she looked down at Ruth, at the way the old woman's lips had turned pale, at the way her body shook in waves. And she understood that if they stayed here a few more hours, Ruth might not survive the night. Pride collided with the fear of losing her, and in the end, that fear won. Knox bent down and carefully slid his arms beneath his mother, lifting her gently, and once again he was shaken when he felt how light she was, almost weightless, as though the years had drained everything out of her. Bear immediately rose and followed, staying close to every step Knox took, not leaving the old woman's side by even half a pace. Della pushed the stroller after them with a rattling sound, one hand gripping its handle tightly, her eyes still watchful. And when the door of the luxurious car opened to reveal the soft leather upholstery and the warmth spilling from inside, she stopped at the threshold, like someone standing between two worlds, neither of which she had ever belonged to. She glanced quietly at the cold man holding his mother in his arms, wondering who, in the end, she had just entrusted the fate of the old woman and her tiny child to. The private hospital Knox brought the three of them to stood on the north side of the city, where the corridors were paved in polished stone, and the faint smell of antiseptic drifted through the air, a place where the name he spoke was enough to send the night staff scrambling to rush a stretcher toward him, without stopping to ask about paperwork. Ruth was taken straight into the emergency room, and Knox stood motionless outside the glass doors, both hands clenched tight inside the pockets of his coat, watching as the doctors slid an IV needle into his mother's bony arm and attached electrode wires to her chest to monitor the uneven, fragile rhythm of her heart. Della sat, curled into herself on a plastic chair in the hallway. The stroller stopped close beside her, one of her hands still resting lightly on its frame where the little girl slept, while Bear lay flat before the threshold of the hospital room, his massive head set on his front paws, yet his eyes remained open, following every shadow that passed by, not allowing anyone to step too close without lifting his head in a low, silent warning. Several nurses who walked past glanced at the enormous dog with wary eyes, but not one of them dared ask him to move aside, because there was something in his calm but unyielding posture that made people understand he wasn't going anywhere. Nearly 1 hour passed before the doctor on duty finally came out, pulled down his mask, and in the somber voice of a man accustomed to delivering unhappy news, told Knox that the old woman's condition was the result of prolonged neglect, not something that had happened overnight. She was severely malnourished, her body depleted of nearly every essential nutrient, and her blood sugar had dropped to a dangerous level. Her heart carried a chronic illness that should have been controlled with medication, taken faithfully every day, and yet from the blood tests, it was clear she hadn't taken her medicine in a very long time, causing her heart to grow weaker and weaker. And there was something else, the doctor said hesitantly, that the confusion, disorientation, and failure to recognize loved ones she was showing all bore signs of memory decline that had progressed through many stages without examination or medical intervention, something that could have been slowed if it had been detected early. Each word he spoke felt like a cold stone dropped into Knox's chest. He turned toward Della, and this time his voice was no longer a command but a tightly restrained question, asking how she had cared for his mother all this time. Della lifted her head, her eyes red from lack of sleep, and in a broken voice she told him that since she moved into that lodging house, the old woman had lived in the room across from hers, always quiet, always alone. At first, she only stopped by to greet her. But little by little, she realized the old woman often forgot to eat, forgot whether she had eaten at all, and some nights Della found her standing in the hallway in the middle of the night, unable to remember which room was hers. She said she didn't have much, that her meager wages were barely enough to keep herself alive, but whenever she managed to cook a pot of porridge or buy a loaf of bread, she always shared a portion with the old woman, took her to the public hospital when she fell, and sat beside her bed on the nights she burned with fever, and called out the name of someone Della had never known. Knox listened, and every detail she told carved deeper into the suspicion slowly freezing solid inside his mind. Because he had paid. He had sent large sums of money home regularly every month for all those years. He had entrusted his mother's care to someone he trusted. So where had that money gone? Where had her medicine gone? Where had the decent home she should have been living in gone? So that she was left to waste away in a ruined, rented room and be kept alive by the kindness of a poor stranger instead of by the very money he had sent. Knox straightened, his gray eyes gradually hardening into a familiar kind of ice, and in his mind, amid the storm of guilt and fury, a name began to rise. silent but sharp, the name of the one person who should have been responsible for everything that had happened here. Knox stepped out of the bright white corridor, stopped at the far end of the ward where the lights were dimmer and no one could listen in, then pulled out his phone, his finger moving quickly across the dark screen, and after only 2 rings, someone picked up on the other end. Toby's voice came through clear and alert, even though it was already well past midnight, because everyone who worked for Knox understood that when he called at this hour, it meant something had gone wrong. Knox didn't waste a word on greetings. His voice was low and flat, chillingly calm, as he said he needed Toby to dig up everything connected to one name, Silas Crane, the man he had hired 8 years earlier through an intermediary office to look after his mother and manage the money he sent home every month. He wanted to know every transaction, where every cent had gone, whose name every asset was under, every contract the man had signed, and he wanted all of it before sunrise. The other end went silent for a moment. Then Toby asked whether something had happened to the old woman, and for the first time in the call, Knox paused for half a second before answering, a hesitation so small that only someone who had served him for years, someone as close and trusted as Toby, would have noticed it. Yes, his mother was in the hospital, and he needed to know why. After hanging up, Knox stood motionless beside the window, looking down at the city stretching beneath him, its sickly yellow lights flickering through the night mist, and for the first time in many years, he felt something unsettled inside his chest, a faint and smoldering instinct he couldn't give a name to. Because Silas Crane had always been a man polished to perfection, a courteous gentleman in sharply pressed suits with a calm smile, someone who had sent him regular reports every quarter, brief lines saying that the old woman was still healthy, still being properly cared for, still living comfortably in the house Knox's money had built for her. He had skimmed those reports between hundreds of other matters. He had believed them without once doubting them, because to Knox, money had always been able to buy peace of mind, and a man paid generously had no reason to betray him. And yet now, standing in the cold corridor of the hospital, he realized how terribly wrong he had been to believe that distance and money could replace presence. He ruled an underworld through fear, a world where no one dared cheat him out of even 1 cent, and yet within his own family, with the very woman who had given him life, he had allowed a man to slip past his eyes for 8 long years without him knowing a thing. He turned back toward the end of the hallway, where Della was still sitting with her head bowed, dozing beside the stroller, where Bear still lay guarding the door to his mother's room with eyes that never fully closed, and a bitter truth rose through him. The man he had paid to care for his mother had abandoned her in the middle of a winter night, while a poor stranger who owed him nothing had risked herself to keep the old woman alive. Knox clenched his fist inside his coat pocket, feeling that familiar layer of ice rising once more into his eyes, the kind of coldness that had terrified every man who had ever stood against him, because he knew with perfect clarity that once the name Silas Crane had surfaced in his mind like this, that man, no matter where he was hiding in this city, had officially run out of places to go. Before the sky had even begun to pale, Toby called back, and from the unusually heavy weight in his voice alone, Knox already knew that the news he was about to hear would be worse than anything he had prepared himself for. Toby reported that the house Knox had once paid for his mother to live in, the small house with a backyard where she was supposed to spend her old age in peace, had been transferred and sold almost 2 years earlier. The paperwork had been handled so skillfully that it would have been difficult to uncover without digging deep, and every dollar from the sale had flowed into intermediary accounts before vanishing without a trace. The money Knox had faithfully sent home every month, instead of being used for medicine, food, and a caregiver, had been drained the moment it arrived, quietly redirected through a chain of sophisticated transactions into Silas Crane's own pockets. And most cruelly of all, when the old woman's confusion grew severe, when caring for her became inconvenient and she no longer held any value to be exploited, he had pushed her into a cheap, wretched nursing facility on the edge of the city, paid a few months in advance as a token gesture, then cut ties completely, until that very place, when it didn't receive another cent, quietly shoved her out onto the street, the way people throw away a broken thing. Toby went on to say that according to what he had traced, the old woman had likely wandered the streets for some time before she was found, and if not for the woman named Della taking her in these past years, she probably wouldn't have survived until tonight. Knox listened to every word Toby spoke in absolute silence, without a single hard breath, without cutting him off once, only his hand that wasn't holding the phone slowly tightening into a fist until his knuckles turned white. When the call ended, He stood there in the deserted hospital waiting room, and the rage rising inside him wasn't the loud, explosive kind of fury that burst outward. It was something cold, thick, and slow, something far more terrifying than any shout. He thought of his mother's hollowed face, of her frozen hands that no longer recognized her own son, of the image of her huddled on the sidewalk, begging a stranger not to drive her away, and he thought of the courteous man with his lying reports that had arrived steadily for 8 years. Every line a lie, every passing quarter, another layer of cruelty piled upon a woman who no longer had any way to defend herself. Knox's arm swung before reason could stop it, and the glass vase on the nearby table flew off, shattering into 100 pieces across the cold tile floor, the sharp sound of breaking glass tearing through the silence of the night corridor. A nurse poked her head out in alarm, but when she met his eyes, she quickly withdrew, and Bear lifted his head from the doorway of the hospital room, his ears standing straight, though the dog didn't bark, as if he understood that this anger wasn't aimed at anyone present here. Knox stood still, looking down at the scattered shards of glass beneath his feet, his chest rising and falling, and he forced himself to draw a long breath, pressing the fury back down beneath the shell of control he had spent his whole life forging, because he knew clearly that unrestrained anger was a luxury he couldn't allow himself right now, that breaking things or killing in a rush of heat wouldn't save his mother, wouldn't reclaim what had been lost, and would only make him lose the sharpest weapon he possessed, his cold calculation. He slowly opened the hand he had clenched so tightly, bent down, picked up a sharp piece of glass, then set it gently back on the table, and when he lifted his head, his gray eyes had returned to their usual frightening calm, the calm of a man who had just silently delivered a sentence. And in his mind, only one thought remained, sharp as a knife, that Silas Crane would pay for every day the old woman had suffered, but not with a hurried bullet in the night. He would pay with something far longer lasting, and far more deserved. When the gray dawn began to slip through the hospital windows, Ruth had been moved to a quiet private room, her heart beat steadier thanks to IV fluids and medication, and Della had finally managed to doze for a little while in the hard chair, her head resting against the side of the stroller where her daughter was still sleeping deeply. Knox stood looking at her for a moment, at the woman in the worn, torn coat, and the shoes whose heels had been rubbed nearly flat, the woman who had done in his place what he should have done himself, and in his mind, in the way he had always handled everything in life, gratitude was instantly converted into a number. When Della woke, he walked over, pulled a check he had already signed from inside his coat, placed it on the small table in front of her, and in the calm voice of a man accustomed to giving orders, said that this was his thanks for everything she had done for his mother, that the amount written on it was enough for her to pay off every debt and live comfortably for a long time. He thought she would tremble, would choke out her gratitude, would snatch up the check the way someone drowning reached for a lifeline in a sea of misery, because that was the reaction he had seen in hundreds of people when they stood before his money. But Della only looked at the check for a moment, then lifted her eyes to him, and what made him go still was that there was none of the hunger in her gaze that he had expected, only something that looked almost wounded. She pushed the check back toward him, gently but firmly, and said she didn't need this. Knox frowned, thinking he must have heard wrong, and he said bluntly that the amount could be higher if she wanted, that he wasn't a stingy man. But Della shook her head, and this time, though her voice was tired, it was steady. She said she hadn't cared for the old woman to be paid, that through the past 2 years she had never once thought there would come a day when someone would press money into her hand for it. She had sat with Ruth on nights when the old woman burned with fever, not because of money. She had shared the last bowl of porridge in her home, not because of money, but only because Ruth was a human being, a lonely human being who needed to be treated like one, and if she accepted this check now, then everything she had done would be turned into something with a price, and she wouldn't allow that to happen. Knox stood in silence, and for the first time in many years, he didn't know what to say. In the world he lived in, everything had a price. Every loyalty could be bought. Every silence could be exchanged for a number large enough, and he had grown used to believing that there was nothing in this world money couldn't reach. And yet the thin woman sitting before him, a woman who was clearly so desperate that every dollar mattered, had refused something that could change her entire life, simply because she didn't want to lose some invisible thing whose name he had almost forgotten. He looked at her, and a strange feeling rose inside him. Not exactly anger, not exactly admiration, but a deep confusion, as though some piece of his solid view of the world had just been shaken loose. He picked up the check, folded it, and slipped it back into his coat pocket without another word. But his gaze lingered on Della's face longer than he meant it to, as if he were trying to understand what had made a person like her. Della said nothing more either. She only turned to tuck the blanket around her daughter again. And in that quiet moment, inside the hospital room washed in the pale light of early morning, something had just begun to take root very softly between two people, from two worlds that shared nothing in common. A seed neither of them had yet had time to recognize. Della's refusal of the check didn't make Knox give up. It only made him more curious. And for a man accustomed to controlling everything, not fully understanding a person standing right in front of him was something he couldn't tolerate. So that very morning, he quietly told Toby to look into her. What Toby reported back made Knox sit in silence for a long while beside the hospital room window. Della worked 2 jobs at once. By day, she helped out at a community clinic on the south side of the city, cleaning, organizing files, and assisting the nurses. Then, when evening came, she hurried across town to wait tables at a late-night diner, keeping her little daughter fast asleep in the old stroller right beside her in a quiet corner of the kitchen, usually returning home only after well past midnight, with her legs aching from exhaustion. Her husband had left when the baby was not even a month old, leaving her to struggle alone in this expensive city. But the detail that tightened Knox's chest was the one about her little daughter. The girl's name was Wynne. She was 3 years old, and when she was born, she had a heart defect, a small hole between the chambers of her heart that required surgery if she was going to survive. That operation had saved the child's life, but it had also left Della with a crushing hospital debt that she had been forcing herself to pay in monthly installments for years, and only recently she had received notice that she was about to be evicted from her rented room because she was behind on rent. And yet, under all those burdens piled one on top of another, this woman had still regularly shared her own meager food with an elderly neighbor who was no blood relation to her, had still spent her last dollars buying cough medicine for Ruth, while her own daughter wore clothes she had already outgrown and shoes with torn toes. Knox turned his head toward the corner of the room, where Wynne had just woken up, rubbing her round eyes before immediately becoming fascinated by the enormous dog lying by the door. The child wasn't afraid the way adults were afraid of Bear. Instead, she broke into a wide smile, toddled over, and placed her tiny hand on his massive head. And strangely enough, Bear only wagged his tail a little, nuzzling his muzzle into that small palm with surprising gentleness. Della hurried over, about to pull her daughter back, but Knox quietly signaled that it was all right. Wynne sat down right on the hospital floor beside the dog, pulled several broken crayons and a wrinkled stack of paper from her old backpack, and began to draw with careful concentration. After a while, the little girl ran over to show her mother the picture she had finished, and in it there was a small house, an old woman with gray hair standing beside a huge black dog, and Wynne said innocently that it was Grandma Ruth, that when Ruth got better, she would draw lots more pictures to give her. The way the child spoke Ruth's name with such tenderness, as if calling her own grandmother, made Knox turn his face away, his throat unexpectedly closing. He looked at the innocent child coloring on the hospital floor, looked at the young mother quietly stroking her daughter's hair with eyes full of both love and exhaustion, and he realized that these two, though they had nothing in their hands, were holding something all his vast fortune couldn't buy. They were so poor they were on the verge of having nowhere left to go, and yet they were still rich enough to give, still warm enough to shelter a stranger in the bitter cold of winter. And for the first time in his life, the man who had once believed money could solve everything began to dimly feel that there were things in this world that lay completely beyond the reach of numbers, things that he himself, with all his power and wealth, was lacking in the most desperate way. A few days later, when Ruth was stable enough to be discharged from the hospital, but still needed close monitoring and constant care, Knox made a decision that even he hadn't expected himself to say aloud, that all 3 of them would stay temporarily in his mansion until his mother recovered. Della objected at once, the pride inside her resisting the thought of becoming someone dependent on the charity of a strange man's household. But Knox only said calmly that this wasn't pity, it was the only reasonable solution, because the old woman needed someone beside her. Della was the person she trusted most, and the mansion had private doctors, and every condition a rented room on the verge of being taken away could never offer. In the end, for Ruth's sake, and for Wynne's too, she had no choice but to nod. Knox's mansion stood apart behind a row of high iron gates, a massive gray stone house with long, echoing corridors, soaring ceilings, and expensive yet cold furnishings. Everything so perfect it felt hollow, like a museum without life. Della walked through those vast rooms without being overwhelmed the way Knox had expected, because to someone who was used to struggling for every dollar, this luxury didn't stir desire. It only made her feel strange and faintly sorrowful, because she realized that a house this enormous could still be frighteningly silent, with not a single family photograph on the walls, not one trace of laughter, not the warmth of a true home. Quietly, she wondered how lonely the man who had lived here alone all these years must have been. Wynne, on the other hand, didn't care about the value of anything around her. To the child, the place was only a fairy tale castle waiting to be explored, and she trotted down the corridors, her clear laughter ringing brightly between the cold stone walls, breaking for the first time the suffocating stillness that had covered the mansion for many years. And following close behind her, never leaving her by even half a step, was Bear. The enormous dog that had once been absolutely loyal to Knox alone now willingly became the child's guard, lying at the foot of the bed when Wynne took her afternoon nap, trailing after her whenever she ran and played. And once Knox caught sight of Wynne asleep with her head resting on Bear's broad, warm back, while Bear lay perfectly still, not daring to move for fear of waking her, Knox stood watching that scene from the end of the corridor, and something strange slipped quietly through his chest. That evening, while Della was fumbling around in the vast, unfamiliar kitchen to warm a little food for her daughter, she accidentally reached for a cup placed too close to the edge of the shelf, and just as Knox stepped in, he reacted by reaching out to catch it at the same time she did. His hand touched hers for one fleeting instant, an accidental touch that made both of them go still. Della quickly pulled her hand back, murmuring an apology, her cheeks faintly flushing with embarrassment, while Knox stood there with the cup in his hand, silent for a moment before the strange warmth that had just brushed across his fingertips, a feeling he couldn't remember the last time he had felt. He set the cup down, cleared his throat, said a few bland words about whether the old woman had taken her medicine yet, then turned and walked away faster than usual, leaving behind a kitchen that now felt a little less cold than before, and a vague question that both of them deliberately chose to ignore. The days inside the mansion passed, and if anyone had the power to melt the layer of ice that had wrapped around Knox for so many years, it wasn't Della, nor was it his mother, but the 3-year-old child who had no idea who he was in the fear-filled world outside. Wynne didn't look at Knox with the wary eyes every adult who had ever faced him had worn. She only saw in him a tall man who was always accompanied by a giant black dog, and in her innocent imagination, she gave him a name of his own. One afternoon, while Knox was sitting in silence at the long desk in his study, Wynne tiptoed in, both hands hidden behind her back, then suddenly held out a sheet of paper in front of him. It was a crayon drawing, clumsy but filled with affection, and in it there was a large man dressed in black, standing beside a dog just as large. And above them, in her crooked childlike handwriting, she had written the words Uncle Bear. Wynne explained innocently that because he was always with Bear, and Bear was as big as a bear, then he was a bear too, a big bear meant to protect the little bear. Knox held the drawing in his hands, and for a moment he didn't know how to react, because it had been far too long since anyone had given him something without calculation, far too long since anyone had looked at him and seen anything other than power or danger. This child had given him a drawing simply because she wanted to, asking for nothing, fearing nothing. And that very innocence touched someplace deep inside him that he had believed had turned numb long ago. That evening, Wynne stubbornly insisted on sitting beside Uncle Bear while waiting for her mother to care for Grandma Ruth. She brought along her whole stack of drawings and her pile of broken crayons, sat on the rug at his feet, and drew with absorbed delight, chattering as she worked, telling him all sorts of rambling stories about school, about the stray cat behind the diner, about her dream of one day having a dog as big as Bear. Knox listened quietly, answering now and then with a curt sentence. But little by little, he realized he had set down his pen and folded his work papers closed, so he could watch every awkward stroke of the child's crayon. Then, without either of them noticing when it happened, Wynne's voice grew softer, her eyelids drooped, and she leaned her head against his arm and fell asleep, her breathing warm and even, her tiny hand still loosely holding a piece of crayon. Knox sat perfectly still, not daring to move, his breath catching as he looked down at the tiny hand curled against his arm, and he lowered his eyes to the innocent sleeping face beside him, a face with no defenses at all, completely trusting her safety to a man the entire city feared. A strange emotion rose thickly in his throat, a tenderness he had buried for so long that he had almost forgotten it had ever existed. Very gently, he reached for a soft blanket nearby and carefully draped it over the child, the movement awkward, like a man who had never done such a thing before. Della stepped out of Ruth's room at that exact moment, and she stopped short at the threshold when she saw the scene before her. The cold, frightening man she had always guarded herself against sitting absolutely still because he was afraid of waking her daughter, his eyes resting on the child with a softness so deep she almost didn't recognize him as Knox. In that moment, something inside Della stirred faintly, and the wall of defense she had built around herself began to crack in one small place, because she understood that a man who could be that gentle with a child must still have a heart somewhere deep inside, beneath all that ice, a heart that hadn't gone completely cold. That night, after carrying Wynne back to her room and tucking the blanket around her, Knox couldn't sleep. He went out to sit on the back porch of the mansion with Bear lying at his feet, and for the first time in many years, he allowed the memories he had always kept locked away to return. He remembered the night he left home when he was 27, remembered the small kitchen warm with the smell of baked bread where his mother had stood. Ruth's face then still bright and full of strength, her eyes looking at him, not with anger, but with a heartbreaking pain, even more terrible than fury. She had known, because somehow a mother always knows, what path her son had stepped onto, that the money he had begun bringing home wasn't clean, that the world he was entering would swallow him whole and turn him into someone she would no longer recognize. She had begged him to stop. She had said she would rather live poor for the rest of her life than watch her son trade his soul for power, that she didn't need a single cent of that kind of money. But Knox had been young then, full of pride and full of wounds he believed only strength could heal. He had shouted cruel words, had said he would prove to her that money could buy everything, including safety, including a future she had never dared dream of. Then he slammed the door and walked into the night, carrying with him the hurt of believing his mother had rejected the path he had chosen, without understanding that she was the one trying to save him. On that cold night, as he strode away with his head down and never once looked back, he heard the patter of feet chasing after him, and when he turned, he saw Bear, then still a clumsy little dog Ruth had rescued from a freezing winter night, panting as he ran after Knox with shining eyes that stubbornly refused to go home. Knox had meant to chase him away, but the dog kept stubbornly following at his heels, and in the end, through all 8 years of drifting through the brutal underworld, Bear became the only living creature who had followed him from the old home, the only living thread still tying him to the mother he had turned his back on, to the warm kitchen, to the person he had once been before the darkness swallowed him whole. He bent down and laid his hand on the old dog's massive head, and Bear lifted his eyes to him with that same loyal gaze, eyes that had watched him grow colder and more ruthless with every passing year, had seen him give orders that made other people tremble, and yet had never once abandoned him. Knox realized that his cruelty hadn't been born from nothing. It had grown out of that very night when he believed love was a weakness, that being rejected meant he had to build walls around himself, that the only way to never be hurt again was to make the whole world fear him. But now, sitting deep in the night with the old dog beside him and the sound of a child's laughter still echoing in his mind, he began to understand that the true price of the path he had chosen wasn't the enemies he had made or the sins he carried on his shoulders, but the 8 years he had lost with the mother who now could no longer even remember her son's face. 8 years that no amount of money in this world could ever buy back. Ruth's health gradually improved under attentive care. Her skin had grown rosier, her hands trembled less, but her mind still flickered like a candle before the wind, at times clear enough to call Della's name, at times sinking back into those vast, fog-filled blanks where she recognized no one. One winter morning, pale sunlight slanted through the window frame, and Knox came into the room to set the tray of medicine on the table as usual. Just as he was about to turn away, he heard his mother call out, not for Della, but by his own name, the name she hadn't spoken in 8 long years. Knox froze, then slowly turned back, and found Ruth's eyes fixed on him, no longer empty and unfamiliar this time, but clear and awake with a clarity that hurt, the eyes of a mother who had recognized her son. She reached her thin, trembling hand toward him, and called him closer, and when Knox knelt beside the bed, she laid her cold palm against his stubbled cheek, her eyes shining with tears. She whispered that she was sorry for being too harsh that night all those years ago, sorry for pushing him out the door, sorry for letting him leave carrying that wound through all these years, and she said not a single day had passed when she hadn't prayed for him to come home. Knox tried to speak, tried to tell her that the fault was his, not hers. But Ruth shook her head, and then she said something that turned his whole body to stone. She told him that through all those years, she had never spent even 1 cent of the money he sent home. She had refused to touch the bank drafts or the packages sent through the agency, leaving them to stack up untouched. Not because she didn't need it, but because she couldn't bring herself to use it. Because in her mind, it was money stained with other people's blood and tears. Money that had stolen away her gentle son and turned him into someone she no longer recognized. She said she would rather go hungry, rather curl up in the cold, than live on that money. Because the only thing she had ever wanted had never been money, or a large, beautiful house, but only to see her son step across the threshold once more, to hear him call her mother the way he had when he was little. Every word she spoke cut deeper into Knox than any knife wound he had ever taken in his life, because he suddenly understood the cruelest truth of all, that for 8 years, while he had gone on deceiving himself into believing that sending money regularly meant he had fulfilled his duty, that providing from a distance was no different from love, his mother had never touched a single dollar, only waited in silence for the one thing he had never sent home, himself. And tragedy had piled upon tragedy, because even the money she had refused had been stolen by someone else, leaving her to suffer hunger and cold and hopelessness. Something inside Knox's chest broke open. The ice he had spent his whole life building cracked wide and melted away, and for the first time since he was a boy, the man the entire underworld city feared bowed his head into his mother's hand and began to weep, his broad shoulders shaking with the choked sobs he could no longer hold back. Ruth gently stroked his hair the way she had once stroked the hair of the little boy he had been, softly whispering that she forgave him, that she had never stopped loving him, not even for a moment. But then, just as that merciless illness always did, the light in her eyes began to fade. Her clarity slowly withdrew like the tide going out, and she blinked at him in confusion, quietly asking who he was and why he was crying beside her bed. Knox held tightly to the hand that was becoming a stranger to him again, forced his tears back down, and softly answered that he was only someone who would never leave her again. Knox still hadn't recovered from the pain of that morning beside his mother's bed, when Toby came to the mansion with an unusually tense face, carrying a stack of documents he'd spent many days and nights tracing, and what he was about to say would overturn everything Knox thought he understood about his family's tragedy. Toby set the file down on the table, lowered his voice, and said that Silas Crane wasn't simply a greedy man who had taken advantage of a weak opening for profit. In truth, he'd been planted there from the very beginning, a pawn already hidden inside the very intermediary agency Knox had trusted when he'd gone there to hire someone to care for his mother 8 years earlier. Knox frowned, and Toby kept explaining, coldly fitting each link into place. That intermediary agency, which had seemed independent and reputable, had actually been taken over in secret, and the man pulling the strings behind it was none other than Dorian Wolfe, the boss of the rival gang Knox had been fighting for territory for years, his sworn enemy, the man who had always tried to destroy him but had never been able to touch him because Knox was too careful and too powerful. Dorian understood that he couldn't defeat Knox with guns or money on a fair battlefield, so he chose a move far more patient and far more poisonous, which was to find the only weakness of a man who seemed to have none, and that weakness was the mother Knox had left behind, the woman he'd believed would be taken care of as long as he kept sending money home. Dorian had quietly arranged everything so that when Knox went looking for someone to look after his mother, he'd unknowingly hire one of Dorian's own people, and Silas had been sent in not to care for Ruth, but to watch her, to hold her, to turn her into a dormant piece on the board, waiting for the day he would be activated. Silas's theft of her money and property was only the side reward he'd given himself while he waited, a filthy greed layered over a cold conspiracy, making his nature even more contemptible, without leaving even the smallest trace of anything worthy of pity. Toby said Dorian had probably meant to save that piece for the decisive moment, to use Knox's mother as leverage to force him to his knees, but the old woman's worsening confusion and the fact that she'd been pushed out onto the street had nearly ruined the entire plan, and that was also why Knox had stumbled upon the truth earlier than his enemy expected. Knox sat in silence and listened, and the more he heard, the farther the cold inside his chest spread, because he realized that his mother's suffering hadn't been a random disaster or some cruel twist of fate, but the deliberate result of a hand that had been setting a trap for him for 8 years right under his nose, while he hadn't known a thing. While he'd believed he was controlling an entire underworld empire, his enemy had quietly slipped deep into the very heart of what he treasured most, turning his own blood into a hostage without firing a single shot. This time, the fury inside Knox wasn't a sudden burst of anger that wanted to smash things. It had hardened into a cold and unmistakable resolve, because now he understood that this wasn't only about demanding justice for his mother from a treacherous caretaker, but a life-and-death confrontation with the most dangerous enemy of his life, a man who'd proven he was willing to target even an innocent old woman to achieve his purpose. And Knox knew that with an opponent like that, this game couldn't end until one of them fell. In the middle of those tense days of preparing for the confrontation with Dorian, Knox realized that Della's presence in the mansion had become the only thing that made his heart settle. Late at night, when the whole house had fallen asleep, the two of them often crossed paths by accident in the kitchen, and the scattered conversations that had begun awkwardly at first slowly grew longer, deeper. Della told him about the exhausting night shifts at the clinic, about the constant fear that one day she wouldn't be strong enough to care for Wynne, and Knox, for the first time in his life, found himself wanting to listen to another person without calculating what benefit they might bring him. One night, when Della happened to mention that she had once dreamed of becoming a real nurse but had been forced to give it up because of the weight of survival, Knox caught himself looking at her longer than he should have, watching the way the yellow light fell across her tired face, a face that still shone with resilience, and a strange warmth rose in him that left him unsettled. But the moment he realized it, he hurriedly raised the familiar wall again, because he understood exactly who he was, understood what his hands had been stained with, and he told himself that someone like Della, clean and decent, deserved something far better than a man like him. As for Della, she also felt the vague affection growing inside her, and it left her both confused and afraid, because she had once trusted a man enough to give him her heart, only to be abandoned without mercy, and now the man making her heart tremble was someone who lived in a world of darkness she couldn't possibly understand. So the two of them remained caught between the longing to move closer and the fear of being hurt one more time, with neither daring to cross that fragile line. But the warmth just beginning to bloom inside the mansion didn't last long, because Dorian Wolfe had started to make his move. One morning, the gardener found a dead crow placed neatly in front of the iron gate, a silent message in the language of the underworld that Knox understood better than anyone. Then, a few days later, one of his restaurants was visited by a group of strange men who came in to cause trouble before leaving, stealing nothing, taking nothing, only leaving behind a blank white business card on the counter, exactly the way Dorian used to remind his enemies that he could reach anywhere, at any time. Toby reported that Dorian's men had been seen lingering near the old neighborhood where Della used to live, and also near the clinic where she worked during the day. Knox immediately tightened security around the mansion, doubling the guards, but an unease rose inside him that he had never known before, because for the first time in his life, he had things to lose: a mother he had only just found again, a child who called him Uncle Bear, and a woman who had quietly slipped into the heart he had thought had turned to stone. He understood that Dorian had seen it too, that the man was silently watching and measuring where the weakest place might be before striking. That night, standing by the window and looking down at the brightly lit yard and the shadows of guards on patrol, Knox clenched his fist and told himself that he wouldn't let his enemy touch those people again, even if he had to sacrifice everything he had built. But deep inside, a cold instinct warned him that Dorian wouldn't aim at him. He would aim at the new weakness Knox had just revealed. Knox's instinct was confirmed in the way he least expected, when Toby returned with a new discovery that even he found staggering. While digging deeper into every possible connection that might lead Dorian to target the mansion, Toby had traced a name from Della's past, the name of the former husband who had abandoned her years ago, and when he compared it with the records of men who had once been tied to Dorian's gang, he discovered that the man had been a desperate gambler who had borrowed enormous sums from Dorian's underground casino, then skipped out on the debt and vanished, leaving behind a blood debt that had never been paid. Toby placed the file in front of Knox with caution, because he understood that this information could throw everything into chaos. For one brief moment, a dark thought passed through Knox's mind. Whether Della's appearance in his mother's life had not been entirely accidental, whether she might be part of the trap, another piece Dorian had planted. But the moment that thought began to rise, Knox felt disgusted with himself, because he had seen her refuse the check, had seen her give food to his mother, had seen the look in her eyes when she stroked her daughter's hair. and no actress in the world could fake that kind of decency. That night, he decided to speak plainly with Della, to place the truth on the table instead of letting it quietly gnaw away at the fragile trust that had only just begun to grow between them. When she heard Knox tell her everything, Della's face went pale, then broke open with shock and pain. Trembling, she said she had never known her former husband had been involved with men like that he had always hidden everything from her, leaving her only debts and a tiny child when he suddenly disappeared in the middle of the night. Through tears, she told him that strange men had come knocking at the door of her rented room a few years earlier, asking about her husband's whereabouts in threatening tones, and she had been so frightened that she kept moving from place to place, working herself to the bone just to protect Wynne from a past she didn't even fully understand. She hadn't known that her accidental move into that lodging house, her accidental place beside Knox's mother's room, was a cruel coincidence of fate, or perhaps a link Dorian had quietly been watching for a long time. Knox looked at the woman sobbing before him, and every trace of suspicion inside him vanished completely, giving way to a deep understanding and a strange ache of tenderness. He realized that the two of them, though born from two separate worlds, had been bound together by the same enemy, pushed into tragedy by the same ruthless hand, into a fate neither of them had chosen. He stepped closer, and instead of the clumsy words of comfort he wasn't used to saying, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of sincerity, and told her that she and Wynne wouldn't have to run for even one more day, that as long as he was alive, no one would be able to touch either of them. Della lifted her eyes to him through her tears, and in that moment, amid fear and hurt, she saw in those cold gray eyes a sincere protection that no one had offered her in far too long. The fragile trust between them, instead of being shattered by this bitter truth, was tested and then made stronger, because both of them understood that from this moment on, they were no longer facing the darkness closing in around them alone. Although Knox had tried hard to persuade Della to stop working for a while and stay inside the mansion where it was safe, her stubborn pride wouldn't let her become completely dependent on him, and she still insisted on keeping her night shift at the community clinic 2 evenings each week, saying that the poor patients there needed her, and she couldn't abandon them. Knox had no choice but to yield, on the condition that he always send people to drive her there and bring her back. But on that fateful night, a staged disturbance at one of his casinos on the other side of the city forced his guards to divide their manpower, and in that brief opening, Dorian made his move. Just as Della stepped out through the clinic's back door into the cold night mist, a black car rolled up, several shadowed figures rushed out, and before she could cry out, a hand clamped over her mouth and dragged her into the vehicle as the tires screamed against the wet pavement. It all happened in only a few seconds, clean and cold, exactly the way Dorian had always operated. The terrible news reached Knox while he was at the mansion, and for the first time in many years, the man who had always kept himself perfectly calm felt true panic crush the air from his chest. His phone rang right after that, and Dorian Wolf's lazy, triumphant voice sounded from the other end of the line. He said he was holding something very precious to Knox, and if Knox still wanted to see the woman unharmed, he would obediently hand over all his territory, his casinos, his business routes, everything Knox had built over so many years, or else she would pay the price for the blood debt her former husband had left behind. Dorian gave a mocking laugh and said this was both business and an old debt that needed to be settled, then gave Knox exactly 1 day to think it over. Knox gripped the phone so tightly it seemed about to shatter in his hand, anger and fear mixing into a violent emotion unlike anything he'd ever tasted, because now his enemy had touched the very thing he had only just dared to treasure. In the middle of that storm inside him, the first thought that flared in his mind was Wynne, and he hurried toward the child's room. Relief rushed through him when he saw that she was still sleeping peacefully in the warm room, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding outside, with Ruth dozing lightly beside her, and at the foot of the bed, Bear lying on guard, his ears upright, his eyes gleaming in the darkness, his massive body like a fortress, wall of protection. The dog lifted his head slightly to look at Knox, and in that loyal gaze there seemed to be an understanding that the time had come for him to guard these small, fragile lives more closely than ever. Knox knelt beside the bed, looked at Wynne's innocent face, and silently promised himself that even if he had to sacrifice his entire empire, or his own life, he absolutely wouldn't let this child wake up in a world without her mother. He stood, wiped the panic from his face, and when he turned to leave, his gray eyes had regained their lethal coldness. But this time, Hidden beneath that ice, there was no longer the soulless cruelty of a crime lord. There was the burning resolve of a man ready to do anything to protect the people he loved. He called Toby, his voice low and decisive, ordering him to gather every resource, because tonight would be the night he took everything back. Throughout that night, Knox sat alone in his study, and he understood that he was standing at the most important crossroads of his life. He could do things the way the Underworld did, gather his men and charge into a bloody gunfight to take Della back. But he knew very well that Dorian had already anticipated that move, and a bloodbath could very likely get her killed in the chaos. He could also hand over the entire empire as Dorian demanded, but he understood all too well that a man like Dorian would never release a hostage once he had power in his hands, and Della's life would still hang by a thread. Then, when he looked up at the Uncle Bear drawing Wynne had given him, still resting on his desk, Knox made a decision that the man he had been 8 years ago would never have imagined. He would give up the very world that had made him. Early the next morning, he did something the entire Underworld would call impossible. He went willingly to Lieutenant Marisol Reyes, the police detective who had spent years trying to bring him down. Reyes looked at him with deep suspicion when he placed a thick file on the table, evidence of Dorian Wolf's entire network, the money laundering accounts, the transport routes, the things the police had longed to obtain for years but had never been able to reach. Knox said plainly that he was willing to surrender everything, including evidence against himself, in exchange for a lawful rescue operation that very night, and a promise that from this moment on, he would leave the Underworld forever. Reyes understood that this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to take down one of the most dangerous gangs in the city, and after a moment of consideration, she nodded. When night fell, a coordinated operation was launched against the abandoned warehouse by the harbor where Toby's intelligence had confirmed Della was being held. While Reyes's special operations team surrounded the outer perimeter, Knox, Toby, and Bear quietly approached from the rear, because no one understood how the Underworld worked better than Knox himself. And in that moment, the old dog once again proved why he was the most loyal creature in Knox's life. In the maze of containers and thick darkness at the harbor, it was Bear who caught Della's scent and led Knox along paths the cameras didn't sweep. And when a guard suddenly appeared and aimed a gun at him, Bear lunged out like a massive black shadow, knocking the man to the ground and pinning him there without Knox having to fire a single shot. Knox found Della tied up in a dark corner, terrified but still unharmed, and when their eyes met in that instant, everything they had not yet managed to say to each other seemed to be understood completely. The final confrontation was brief and decisive, because when Reyes's forces stormed in from every direction, Dorian's men were quickly overwhelmed, and Knox, instead of killing his enemy in hatred, the way his old self would have done, only disarmed Dorian with cold precision and handed him over to the police to be cuffed on the spot. When the crime boss shouted bitterly that Knox would regret giving everything up, Knox only answered calmly that he wasn't giving up anything at all. On the contrary, for the first time in his life, he was taking back what was truly worth having. He took off his coat and draped it over Della's trembling shoulders, helped her stand, and Bear trotted over to nuzzle his head against her leg as if in joy, completing the circle of loyalty that had been kept alive through all those years. Amid the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars and the bitter cold lake wind, Knox held the woman he loved, and for the first time in many years, he felt free. In the days that followed, justice was carried out not through the barrel of a gun or the law of the Underworld, but through the very path Knox had once looked down on, the law itself. With the vast body of evidence he turned over, Dorian Wolf faced a series of serious charges, from kidnapping and extortion to running a criminal network, and the once notorious crime boss finally found his hands locked in cuffs behind prison bars, where he would remain for many years. Silas Crane, the man who had heartlessly drained and abandoned an old woman who could no longer defend herself, was also tracked down and brought before the court, forced to repay every dollar he had stolen, calculated down to the smallest detail, while also receiving a prison sentence for his crimes. Even Della's former husband, swept up in the massive raid on Wolf's syndicate, was finally captured to face justice for his long-standing debts and criminal ties. Knox didn't choose to end them in a storm of rage the way the man he used to be would have done, because he understood that death was too easy a release, while forcing the wicked to live and face the consequences of their own actions was the most fitting and lasting punishment. As for himself, Knox kept his promise to Lieutenant Reyes. He quietly dismantled the entire Underworld empire he had spent so many years building, moved his businesses into legal and transparent operations, and faced his own legal consequences with a rare sincerity. With the money his mother had never touched all those years ago, along with the assets recovered, he established a charity fund named the Ruth Hartley Foundation, dedicated to helping abandoned elderly people and struggling families, so that no one would ever have to curl up on a freezing sidewalk the way his mother once had. Della, too, was quietly helped by him to pay off the hospital debt from long ago, and with his encouragement, she returned to pursue the dream of becoming a real nurse, the dream she had once been forced to set aside. One early spring afternoon, when the first warm sunlight rested softly over the blossoming garden behind the new house, a true home now, no longer the cold mansion it had once been, the small family gathered together. Ruth sat in a wooden chair, her health far more stable now, though her memory still came and went, her eyes following Win as the child played with Bear on the grass, her bright young laughter ringing through the breeze. In one rare moment of clarity, Ruth turned to look at Knox sitting beside her, gently took her son's hand, and asked if he was happy. Knox fell silent for a moment, his gaze moving toward Della as she smiled at him with quiet tenderness, toward the child calling out Uncle Bear in her cheerful little voice, toward the loyal old dog lying at his feet, and he realized that all the power, money, and fear he had spent his life gathering had never once given him the feeling of wholeness that this simple moment did. He gently squeezed his mother's thin hand, then reached for Della's hand, and softly answered that for the first time in his life, he was truly happy, because he finally understood that the most precious thing in this world wasn't what we could buy with money, but our presence beside the people we love. And this time, he would never leave again. He would stay. The story of Knox and Della closes in that sunlit garden, but the lesson it leaves behind may linger in each of our hearts for a very long time. Sometimes, in the rushing current of life, we become so busy chasing money, fame, and power that we forget the people we love most, need only our presence, a hand to hold, a meal shared together, a sincere question asked with care. Money can build a house, but it can't create a home. It can provide from a distance, but it can never replace the warmth of being there. This story also reminds us of something simple, yet deeply meaningful, that human dignity and kindness are priceless, that a person, no matter how poor, can still be rich in the way they give love, and that sometimes the one who saves our life isn't the strongest or most powerful person, but the kindest one, the one who knows how to respect others. If this story has touched your heart, please click the subscribe button for our channel, like and share this video, so we can spread these meaningful messages together, and so you won't miss the moving stories we bring to you every day. How do you feel about this story? And what does it make you think of in your own life? Is it possible that sometimes we, too, accidentally forget to make time for the people we love? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always cherish every story and every feeling you choose to share with us. Thank you for spending your time listening all the way to the very last moment. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love beside your family and loved ones. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.